Thank you, Anna, for the introduction, and thank you to the organisers for allowing me to come and asking me to speak on this topic, which made me think quite a long time. What can I say about customer perspectives on forensic science? So what I'm going to do is divide this talk into two sections. In the first section, I'm going to talk about customers in operational practice. And the second section, which will be a little shorter, I'm going to talk about the role of customers when it comes to research and development and innovation. So first, I spoke to a senior judge a couple of weeks ago. We were just having a conversation at a previous conference, and I told him that the title of the talk that I'd been asked to give, and he said, well, that's really simple. We're the customer, the courts, that's it. But of course, only a very small proportion of the work that we do ends up in the courts. So the courts are our customer, but they're not our only customer. What about the other participants in the justice system? What about the investigators? What about the victims of crime? What about the suspects and defendants? What about other court participants? And those all need to be considered in some way. And the other thing I was thinking of was that customers can be internal or external as well. They don't have to be commercial customers. So I'm going to start with a couple of definitions. A customer is a person or an organisation who buys goods or services, if we take a fairly standard definition. But then we've got all sorts of other people that I've just mentioned who are involved in forensic science. So we need some other sort of definition. And a consumer is a person or organisation that consumes or uses goods or services. So we have two different sets of people, perhaps. But what are the attributes of someone who is a customer? And the first one is money. The customer pays, the immediate customer pays, and all forensic science laboratories, I would suggest, have funding from one or more organisations. So I want to break at the very beginning this idea that a customer is only to do with a commercial organisation, because we all get our money from somewhere. And I don't know anyone whose money comes with no strings whatsoever, because there are some expectations then from our customer and from whoever provides the money. So that's the second thing that I'd say about customers. As well as providing some money, they have some level of influence. And the level of influence they have will differ between organisations. They will differ between types of customer, whether they're commercial, non-commercial, internal, external. But I would be very interested, and perhaps in the panel debate, if anyone has a source of money that comes with no strings whatsoever and no expectations, I'd be really pleased to hear about it, and I'm coming to work for you. So they have expectations as well. They have expectations in terms of cost, in terms of quality, perhaps, in terms of service level, perhaps. And they might want some sort of performance measurement, say how are you doing with their money, how are you spending it, and so on. So even those who are directly funded by government will have some strings attached, will have some customer influence. And then there are all the people who have legitimate expectations of forensic science. Now, in here, just to simplify things, I've put investigation first, but it could also be that much broader sort of area of work around intelligence that we particularly heard from Simon Walsh earlier, but we've heard from others as well. So there are different times at which forensic science is used within the justice system as a whole. But for simplification, and because I had no more room on the slide, I've put investigation first. And then there's normally a decision point. There's a decision maker who will decide whether or not a case is going forward to court, whether there's going to be a prosecution or not. And in our jurisdiction, that's the Crown Prosecution Service. In other jurisdictions, it will be different people. And then there's the court. So if we think about those in turn, if we think about the investigation phase, well, our primary person who's going to have expectations of us at that point is the investigator. And that investigator will want various things, but they'll want things to be quick, cheap, and as much information as possible, preferably a name and address. And that's why DNA databases are so tremendously useful as our fingerprint databases, because it goes straight to the quick, cheap, as much information as possible. But if we think only about the investigator, we miss out, well, what about the complainant's expectations? And this is a particular issue when we go to crime scenes, for a volume crime particularly. Because it may be that we don't have a lot of time or money to spend on volume crimes, but there is still an expectation from that person that you will take seriously the fact that their house has been burgled. And they may want no stone to be unturned. Now, it's unlikely that they'll get that necessarily, but they will have expectations. And a suspect, although they may not put it in these terms, presumably will want exculpatory evidence to be found if it's present. So then if we move on and think about that next decision point, is there going to be a prosecution or not? There's a decision maker there too, and like I said, in England and Wales, that's the Crown Prosecution Service. And what they would like is for it to be understandable. What have we actually done? Is it clear? Do I understand it? Do I understand its impact on the case? Now, the Code for Crown Prosecutors in England and Wales gives 3 tests that a prosecutor must apply when making that decision on whether or not to prosecute. And those are, is the evidence reliable? Is it credible? And is it admissible into a court of law? And then they make a subsequent decision around, is it in the public interest to prosecute? But those are the main things that they're going to want to know. And ideally, they'd really love it to be black and white and really clear. Just tell me, is this very clear? And then if it does go on to court, and that is a small minority of cases, we've then got, adding into that mix, the judge, the lawyers, the jury, or, you know, that's in our jurisdiction, you may have different court participants. So they're going to want those same things. They're going to want to know that they're going to want it to be understandable. They're going to want it to be reliable, credible, and admissible. But they're also going to want perhaps as few limitations to the evidence as possible. They're not going to want to have to think about, oh, well, when I'm considering that, I have to consider that actually in this circumstance it might not be quite right. But where there are limitations, they're going to want to know them. They're not going to want to have hidden limitations to the evidence, and they're going to want to have a balanced set of evidence. So we can add on to that there will be policymakers and regulators potentially who also have some sort of expectations of forensic science. So just as an example of a policy decision that has impacted on forensic science in England and Wales recently, the Home Secretary announced that we would have 20,000 more police officers, and they would be recruited as quickly as possible, and there'd be all these extra police officers. And those funding came with that for those extra police officers. But in the vast majority of cases, no extra funding came to functions like forensic science, even though 20,000 extra officers will be seizing more drugs, more mobile phones, and more evidence all over the place. So the policymakers do have an impact, whether they realize it or not, when they make those policy decisions. In my previous role, I was a regulator, and so I had expectations as to the quality that people would perform their work to. So they can also have an impact and expectations. So if we understand that we have all these different people who have expectations, perhaps that's all right then, we can just work with that. But one of the issues is that sometimes there may be clashes of expectations between those different people and between those different groups of people. And perhaps it's at its most extreme when that clash is between the customer, the direct customer who's spending the money, and other people in that justice system, the consumers, who are not spending the money but still have expectations. So what I wanted to do over the next 10 or 15 minutes is think about some cautionary tales, some things that have actually gone wrong because of those sorts of clashes of expectations, and then think about some actual positive, practical mitigations to the risks that it causes. But perhaps we'll just start with a very clear statement that we expect that most time and money is going to be spent on the most serious issues, and least time and money is going to be spent on the least serious issues. But throughout, there'll be some baseline expectations, and those baseline expectations might include quality, timeliness, efficiency, those sorts of baseline things that should be a given. So the first cautionary tale then, bearing that in mind, I'm going to bring up is a cautionary tale about resources. And many of you may have followed events in England and Wales over a period of time and seen that the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee did a very in-depth review into forensic science in England and Wales. I just wanted to quote a couple of little pieces of evidence that were given to the Lords. And one of them came from David Hartshorn, who provided evidence, in fact, alongside Mark Pearce, who's over here. And what he said was, one concern that we have seen over time is that the balance of price within the evaluation has risen, and that's the evaluation of tenders. If you go back a few years, it was considered to be about 40% of the evaluation of a tender. Now it's 60%, and in some areas even higher than that. This means that it's very difficult to differentiate a tender submission on anything other than price. It becomes the primary differentiator. So if you keep that in your mind and then listen to just a moment of the written evidence from a different organisation, Forensic Science Northern Ireland, and they pointed out that when suppliers are competing for essentially the sole customer in their geographic region, it's a monopsony in which the market fails and prices are driven down excessively. The risk of losing the customer becomes an existential issue for the supplier. And you can see when you hear those couple of pieces of evidence that that's a really big issue, that's a really big risk in terms of resources being taken out of our provision of forensic science. And it's not a theoretical problem, because it did, in fact, in 2018, one of the suppliers of forensic science went into administration in England and Wales. And fortunately, they did find an investor and they did come out of that, but it's not a theoretical problem. If we take too much resource out, we end up with a really big set of risks and problems that we don't want to have. But resources aren't only a commercial issue. Sometimes when there is a service and it's provided in a manner that appears to be free at the point of use. So let's take, for example, digital forensics in England and Wales again, which is primarily provided by the police. So the investigators think, oh, well, we've just got our own digital unit. I can just submit anything to it. I can just give them loads of phones and it doesn't matter because it's free. I'm not paying anything for it. But when you've got that sort of increasing or unconstrained demand, and you've also got some level of expectations about service levels, on one hand. The other hand, you've got budgetary pressures. You've got your 20,000 extra police officers and no extra money coming into forensic science. And you've got increasing technical complexity. Then what you end up with is it being really difficult to balance those expectations. And the competing expectations of our customers and our consumers need to be balanced against finite resources. And so what has tended to be the case in commercial provision is that when something gives, it's stability, and all that comes with that, including investment in people, investment in innovation, and so on. But in the non-commercial world, where you perhaps in some instances have a completely unconstrained source of demand and unconstrained resources, what tends to give is timeliness. And it's not exclusively timeliness, but that is one of the things that I have seen. And just a very quick look around the world in preparation for this talk, I find lots of quotes from people in different parts of the world, different continents of the world, all expressing the same sorts of problems that they were finding. More work coming in, no more resources, timescales going up, backlogs developing. And we shouldn't think that backlogs are without consequence, and I think that's a really important point. And I want to use this illustration, and again, this is from England and Wales, but I'm sure these sorts of issues are seen elsewhere. But a particular area of concern for me is how we deal with rape allegations in our jurisdiction. And the year ending March 2020, there were 58,845 rapes reported to the police in England and Wales. In that same year, only 4,884 got to a decision point as to whether someone should be charged or not. And of those, only 1,867 proceeded to a charge. And one of the things that feeds into there are many problems that feed into that, but one of the problems that feed into that came out in a review by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of the Crown Prosecution Service, and they were looking at what's going wrong in this field. And one of the things that they said is they noticed the delays, and they said in the inspection we saw requests for forensic examination of phones taking up to 11 months to complete. And the inspection evidence is that delay is more than likely a contributing factor to attrition in the cases in the system, so to that fall off between the cases reported to the police and those that are charged. There was some evidence that cases that had been delayed, the complainant withdrew their support and the police categorised the cases as no further action without coming for a charging decision. So there is an impact when we have backlogs and when we have delays. Another cautionary tale, completely different topic this time. And this one was about unbalanced commissioning of work. And in this particular case, it was a case of David Butler. It was heard in Liverpool Crown Court a number of years ago. A search of the National DNA database with some DNA evidence from the scene came up with 3 possible names, because it wasn't a full profile, it was a partial profile. There were 3 possible names. David Butler's name was one of those, and he was, quite quickly, the police's main suspect. But they'd got these other 2 inconvenient names, and they asked the forensic scientist, is there anything in the DNA profiles that would point away from it being those other 2 people? And the forensic scientist looked at it, and actually the pattern of degradation and so on did point away from these other 2 names, and that, so far, so good. But the scientist was not commissioned to do that same look-see at whether David Butler's DNA really was a good match or whether there was anything pointing away from him also being a contributor to the stain. So in that case, the commissioning was unbalanced. The lack of balance wasn't sufficiently challenged by the first forensic scientist, and it was only when it came to defence review that that was picked up. So the system was unbalanced in that case. It was picked up in the end, but the immediate customer there had a bit too much control. Another cautionary tale that picks up on one that I heard in the last session as well. It's that priority of what's quick and easy and cheap over what's the most relevant evidence in the case. And digital forensics is ever more popular. Fingerprints are really popular, DNA is really popular, and footwear is quite popular. But fibres is really unpopular. Fibres takes a long time and costs a lot of money. And so what's happened over time is it's become used less and less, and it's become requested less and less. And I picked up on it was just in a newspaper article about some work that Angela Gallup and her team had done on the 1989 Coastal Path murders. And initially, they'd been asked to come and do a cold case review, but they'd been asked to just do DNA. And that was purely on the grounds of cost. Just look and find me some DNA in this cold case. And they spent months looking for DNA. And they didn't find anything. And then eventually, they persuaded the officers to let them look at fibres and look at some. The bodies had been covered with branches, and those branches were still in a police store. And they found some fibres on the branches that matched to the gloves from the suspect, and that led to finding of a very tiny speck of DNA. But our fibres expertise is in danger to some extent because it is so rarely requested and so rarely allowed, even when it is suggested. So that's a danger as well. And I think my final cautionary tale at this point is the pressure to change reports. I don't know if anybody has ever come under pressure to change a report, whether from a commissioning party, whether from someone in their own organisation or from anyone else. But Bond Solon is a company in the UK that does a lot of expert witness training. And every year they team up with the Times newspaper to do a survey of expert witnesses. Now, to be clear, this is not forensic science expert witnesses alone. This is expert witnesses across the board. So there'll be medical experts, there'll be experts in engineering, there'll be all sorts of experts, but forensic science experts will be in there as well. And if you look at the non-medical experts in that graph, the question was, in the last 12 months, have you been asked or felt pressurized to change your report by an instructing party in a way that damages your impartiality? And about 20% of the non-medical experts said that they had been asked to or felt pressured to change their report, which I thought was quite a high percentage. Actually, I thought that was really quite worrying. So if I summarise the risks and where I've got to with this before I move on to some more positive ideas of mitigation, we've got money, influence and expectations. There's a risk around when the immediate customer has a disproportionate level of control. You'd expect the immediate customer who's paying to have some legitimate expectations, but the risks come when they've got a disproportionate level of influence and control. On the other side, there's a whole set of similar risks if there's no effective mechanism to balance supply and demand. So you can end up through those with all sorts of impacts, from unbalanced commissioning to the expectations of some parties being fulfilled and others not, to financial instability, to pressure to change reports, to all sorts of potential impacts from those risks. So that means it's something we've got to do something about. But interestingly, this is not by any means a new problem or a new phenomenon. And the case assessment and interpretation approach, which many of you will be familiar with, was actually produced in 1998. It was first published in 1998. And part of the reasoning behind publishing that was to enable decisions to be made that will deliver a value for money service, meeting the needs of our direct customers and the criminal justice system. It was about balance. It was about how can we actually put together a system for making the right decisions in cases. And the principles of that followed through into the NCV guideline for evaluative interpretation as well. Now, I'm not going to stand here and give a lecture on case assessment and interpretation, especially not with Tasha and Christoph just sitting there in the audience. But I would point those of you who are not familiar with it to this really good book from the Royal Statistical Society that sets it all out in great detail. But in essence, it's a logical, probabilistic approach to addressing the facts and issue in criminal investigations. And it separates the role of forensic scientists into two different areas. One is investigative, and you could broaden that out to be intelligence or other applications as well. But that's where you're working with the police, you're doing things to help the investigation at an early stage, you're putting forward possible explanations. And your primary customer at that point is the investigator. Although, of course, it's important not to lose sight of the other potential later customers. But you've got a different customer when you're doing evaluation. And that's where my friend, the senior judge, comes in with his point, we're the customer. Because the court participants there are possibly the primary customers for that work, or consumers for that work. And so this enables us to really think about, what role am I in? Who's my primary customer? Where should I be focusing my work? And the main steps in the case assessment and interpretation process are that you get the relevant information together, you clarify and define what the requirements are, and then you develop a proposal for a cost-effective examination strategy. So you're trying to, first of all, what level of offence am I looking at? Am I trying to answer this at a subsource level? Whose DNA is it? Or actually, is that not much value here? It might be the valuable thing at the investigative point, But if I'm going on to evaluation, I'm probably going to be wanting to look at the activity level. So you're going to want to say, what role am I operating in? What level am I operating in? What's the information I need to form propositions and so on? And that enables you to come up with, you put together a set of probabilities that help you, before you've done any work in the lab, to look at what might be the more effective and the less effective ways of approaching the case. Which type of analyses might you want to do? And this really picks up a very similar theme that we heard from Simon earlier. So far so good. I think it's a really good way of approaching the issue. But what happens when the customer won't agree that examination approach? And that's where we end up in difficulties. Whether they're just saying, here's a swab, what's DNA profile? Don't want anything else from you, forensic scientist, that's all I want to know. Problem with that, we don't know then what that means in the context of the case. Or they're saying, it's a rape case, but I only want you to do this one swab. And, you know, there's no real thought about how the semen came to be on that swab and so on. So the first step, I think, for any forensic scientist is to make sure there's no misunderstanding. And then the second step is how will any constraints that have been put on your strategy impact on your ability to properly and impartially evaluate the results of the analysis. And this is much more when you're in evaluative mode, because you're in investigative mode, it's quite a different set of issues. But if your analysis and interpretation becomes constrained by what your customer will allow you to do, that must be made clear to the court. And that is our responsibility as forensic scientists. And it's a matter of professional integrity and ethics. And it's a matter on which all forensic science organizations must support their forensic scientists. But that can be a really difficult conversation to have. And it can be a really difficult conversation to have, whatever sort of organization you're in. And I was reminded of a quote from another senior judge, or former senior judge in our jurisdiction, Sir Brian Levison. And he came to my conference when I was regulator, and he said, those of us that work in an area where scientific evidence matters are rewarded by being involved with some of the most fascinating and engaging parts of criminal justice. But to ensure we have effective scrutiny and to ensure that the public retains confidence in the system, we must make sure that we see the rules and regulations as supportive and not superfluous. And I was thinking to myself, how can we see in this situation the rules being supportive? And actually, we have some really good criminal procedure rules in our jurisdiction, and they are supportive of the expert because they make very clear what the duties of the expert are. And so, for example, the duty to help the court achieve justice overrides any obligation to the person from whom the expert receives instructions or by whom the expert is paid. That's in black and white, and it's backed up in the criminal practice directions, which actually put a requirement on the forensic scientist to declare that in the case. They say that if the expert's not able to give an opinion without a qualification, they must state that qualification. So if my interpretation has been constrained by what I've been allowed to do in my strategy, I must, under the rules, state how that impacts on my results. I must state the limitation. And if there's anything which might reasonably be thought of undermining my credibility, again, like being constrained in what I was allowed to do, then I've got to start declaring that as well. And these actually are really helpful for the forensic scientist in a conversation with a difficult customer, because you can say, look, it's there in black and white, I have to do this, it's my obligation, it's my legal obligation as an expert. And the last document that I published as regulator was this standard on development of evaluative opinions. And in that document, we just really repeated that as well. We said, and if an instructing party dictates an examination strategy that in the opinion of the expert is unlikely to assist with addressing the issues in the case, or does not enable the expert to take a balanced approach, then that party should be advised, preferably in writing accordingly, and the advice and the conversations shall be recorded on the case record. Any resulting limitations on the interpretation shall be described in the report. And that just, You know, your customer may not want you to put those things in the report, and that can be, as I say, a difficult conversation. But if it is a requirement of the rules, that helps you to overcome that difficulty. It takes the responsibility to some extent and puts it on the regulator's shoulders. So just to summarise this bit on operation practice, my view is that a single customer, having a view of one customer, is insufficient. We've got to look at the customers and the consumers, all the people who have a legitimate interest in what we're doing as forensic scientists. A balanced view of the needs of all those interested parties is much more compatible with science and justice than is the view of a single customer. So I'm going to move on the last 10 minutes and talk about innovation. And if we're thinking about research, we start on the left-hand side, we start with the blue skies research. And that knowledge for knowledge's sake, it's critical and it needs no customer. It's science, it's pure science, it doesn't need any customer. But if we're then trying to pull things across that valley of death and actually get them implemented into operational practice, then we have a different issue. And if we don't have any end user pull, then innovation may fail to reach implementation. So what can be really helpful is to have this view of technology push and market pull. And there has to be some technology push because actually often our customers don't know the art of the possible. And this is not just around development of a gadget or a technique. It's about development of better interpretation, better data, all those sorts of things. But ideally, we also want to be informed by research from our colleagues in the social sciences about what are crime trends, what's the future of crime going to look like, where do we need to be researching now so that we're not behind in 5 years' time. But we do also want a level of pull so that we're not developing things that nobody actually wants. Speaking of which, we can end up with solutions that are searching for a problem. And the thing that immediately sprung to mind was the FSS lab in a van. And this was long before integrated devices were available for rapid DNA analysis. And so it was a huge container lorry with 2 full labs in it and a whole set of ruggedized equipment. Beyond the pilot studies, it was never rolled out into operational practice. Nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted to pay for it. The demand wasn't actually there. And it is important to recognize that even really good innovation and even really good research and fundamental research, you know, we can struggle to get anywhere with it if people don't understand why we're doing it and why it's important. And then the other side of things, we can also have problems searching for a solution. And if we fail to anticipate the requirements of our customers, then our innovation is unlikely to be timely. So whilst there have been steps forward in, you know, meeting the demand for extraction and even to some extent analysis of data from digital devices, there's much less progress on the vital interpretation and understanding of those traces. And there's much less progress on how we're going to manage those reams and reams of data that are coming off. And bearing in mind that we said earlier about regulatory importance, what about data protection? And what about keeping these vast amounts of data without properly sorting and searching and sifting and getting rid of data that we shouldn't have? So we do need to understand our end user requirements if we're going to be successful, but we also need to inform those user requirements as well. Because our customers don't always know what they want or what might be possible or indeed what they need. Funders don't always value what is needed. And we had an example of this raised in the questions in one of the earlier sessions as well. I can get funding for developing a technology, but I can't get funding for doing some fundamental research into transfer and persistence of traces. So we need to engage with those end users, with those customers, with those consumers. Dare I say, in a room with many academics, but I have an academic hat myself, academics can be remote from the practicalities facing practitioners. Not always, but they can be. And practitioners can be reluctant to change. And I say that having run a research department in the FSS at one point, when we had 6 laboratories around the place, and the only thing they could agree on was that they didn't like what was coming out of R&D. So, it is an issue. We have to engage with people. And it's really easy to talk about collaboration, but it's much more difficult to make it actually happen in a way that makes a difference. And we really need to be engaging between the police, the courts, the forensic scientists, the academics, the funders, the policymakers, the regulators. And it needs to be a real engagement and not just paying lip service to it. I mean, from my personal experience, I became a much better researcher when I'd done casework for a while. And I was a better caseworker because I'd done research for a while. Because if you stand and walk in each other's shoes for a while, it makes you better. And again, my senior judge colleague, who I've referred to a few times, one of his big issues is he says, no forensic scientist should ever only be instructed by the prosecution or only be instructed by the defense. Everyone should be doing instructions from both. The final bit that I want to talk about is validation, and because that's another important point of pulling our research forward into operational practice. And a great deal of the PCAST report, of which there has been much debate, was considering whether methods were validated or not. But the thing that struck me is, well, what method and for what purpose? I can't answer the question, is probabilistic genotyping validated? Is it valid? Is it reliable? There are no parameters around that. What am I going to use it for? And then I can tell you how I would go about validating it. I can scale it appropriately. Then, if it is an intelligence issue where you just want something quick and dirty and you're not going to compromise or destroy any evidence for other purposes, your user requirement is one thing and your validation might be extremely quick. If your user is the court and it's a very critical piece of probative evidence, then your user requirement is completely different and your validation will be a much more substantive piece of work. So another cautionary tale, this time from outside forensic science. In January 1986, the Challenger space shuttle exploded 73 seconds after takeoff. And the immediate cause of that explosion was the failure of the right solid rocket booster's O-ring seal. So had it been tested? Had it been validated, if you like? Yes, but never below freezing. And the launch was 18 degrees below. And the pressure to launch was because it had been put off several times, and it was really important. There was political pressure to launch. And it's always some reason why we're being pushed to do some sort of forensic analysis in an important case, because it's a really important case, and this is the one we need to use it in. But if we haven't tested it for that type of use, whatever that is, then we are at risk of causing major problems for the future. I pull again on some of our requirements that are written down in the criminal practice directions, because they state very clearly for us what the court's end user requirements are for validation. And bear in mind what I say, it depends what your user is as to how much you have to validate. So you need to think about who are the users for this and then consider all of their requirements. But if it's for the court, then there are factors listed that we're going to want to take account of. And I'm quite impressed actually that these in fact even mention uncertainty of measurement. So, you know, that's some nice clear statements of requirements. So just summing up, I think ultimately our customer is justice, and a single customer view is insufficient when we consider operational practice. We've got to look much wider than that. We've also got to consider our customers, our end users, our consumers, in whatever those whatever sphere they operate, whether it's intelligence, whether it's investigation, whether it's court. We've got to consider them in our innovation, in what we're doing and in how we're validating it, because it makes success more likely. I've just put up a little bit there about the beginning of our criminal procedure rules, and that the overriding objective of this procedural code is that criminal cases be dealt with justly. And it goes on to describe in more detail what that might be. And I don't think we could argue with that, but we just have to fit ourselves into that system and make sure that what we're doing, what we're being asked to do, is not inconsistent with that outcome. And with that, I will end. There are my email addresses. I'm in London. If you want to visit me when you're in London, you'd be more than welcome. Thank you.